I was about to go home, but after everything that happened, I guess staying later at work is what saved my life that day. It was 3 p.m. on a Friday, and I was about to submit the final report for the week. "Any plans for the weekend, Blake?" my coworker Joe asked as he leaned on my desk. "Just gonna sleep until I can't sleep anymore," I replied. "Well, we're almost out of the woods, just one more week until the deadline," he said. "Yeah, well, if the client's not satisfied, then we wasted a lot of time. And he does look like the type that's never satisfied." "Bye, guys," Dustin said in passing as he headed for the exit. We waved him off silently. "See that guy?" Joe crossed his arms. 3 p.m. and boom, he's out of the office. Not 1 minute later. There was a female voice shouting from the back of the room. "Hey Joe, did you send me that thing I asked?" "I'll send it to you Monday," Joe shouted back. He turned back to me and rolled his eyes, saying it quietly, "And then there's Jessica, never leaving the office." I silently nodded, tapping the enter key on my keyboard and shutting down the computer. "You gonna head home soon?" I asked as I packed my things. "Yeah, in a few. Gotta finish one thing." "Well, you take it easy now, Joe. You know that the company doesn't encourage staying late on Fridays." I winked at him as I stood up. Joe was about to say something, but he was rudely interrupted. A noise blared so loudly that I thought my eardrums would pop out. Sirens. Although I could tell their source was really far away, it was still agonizingly loud. My coworkers clasped their hands over their ears, shouting something, but I couldn't hear them over the sound of the sirens. The wailing dropped and then completely ceased, but only for a moment. "What the fu—" was all Joe managed to mutter, before the sirens started blaring once more, rising in tone and remaining constant for another 10 seconds or so, before stopping once more. I myself had been holding my hands on my ears, bracing myself for another blare, but luckily it never came. "What the hell was that?" Christian, our manager, asked, emerging from his office. "An enemy attack?" "Maybe Iran decided to go for a preemptive strike," Lorraine said, as the remaining 6 of us who were still in the office gathered around. "What in the—" Christian said as he turned his gaze to the window. The rest of us jerked our heads in the same direction, and my jaw dropped to the floor. The street outside, which was clearly visible on a normal day, was completely obscured by yellow-looking fog. We rushed to the window, squinting to try and see something. I couldn't make anything out further than a few feet away, the entirety of the view providing nothing but yellow. "Is that smog?" Joe asked, leaning forward to the point of almost pressing his face against the glass. We stared in silence for a moment, before another sound which I likened to an engine whirring appeared. At first I couldn't tell what it was, but as it got louder, it became apparent that the whirring was actually coming from a helicopter, and it was somewhere above the building, even though we couldn't see it. "Please go inside the closest building you can find and stay there until further notice." A voice that sounded like it was coming through a megaphone blasted along with the helicopter's whirring. "Repeat, do not try to go outside under any circumstances. Stay inside and lock your doors." The position of the voice seemed to change slightly, making it difficult to pinpoint where exactly it was coming from. I placed my ear against the pane of glass, wincing at how cold it was. "Repeat, stay inside and— oh shit, watch out!" The helicopter's engine roared above our heads so loudly that I thought for a moment it would crash on top of us. It then faded to a distance before there was a crash so loud that the entire building shook momentarily. "Holy fuck," Joe said, stepping away from the window. The entire office was eerily silent all of a sudden. No whirring of helicopters, not even my coworkers' voices. I heard my own heart beating against my chest. What the fuck just happened? "Did the helicopter crash?" I asked with a quivering voice, more to kill the silence than to get an answer. My coworker Milo strode to his desk, snatched the jacket off his chair, and hastily put it on. "What are you doing, Milo?" Christian asked him, as the rest of us shot him judgmental glances. "My family is out there. I have to get to them," he said and started towards the exit. Whoa, slow down there, cowboy." Joe stopped in front of him, holding his hands out in a stop sign. "Didn't you hear what they just said? We can't go outside now." "Get out of my way, damn it." Milo pushed him aside and went down the lobby. The rest of us shouted after him, trying to convince him to stay, but he ignored us. He forcefully pushed the glass entrance door open and stepped outside. A gust of cold air immediately entered the room, along with yellow wisps of the fog, which twirled around and disappeared shortly after. Milo disappeared in the wall of yellow within a second of stepping outside, and the rest of us instantly went quiet. We held our breaths in anticipation, staring at the door in silence. After about a minute, we started to assume that Milo either safely made it to his car and was about to start it, or he quietly choked to death on the way there. What happened to Milo, though, was much worse than what any of us assumed. Joe took the initiative to approach the door and lock it, holding his shirt over his mouth along the way. There was a loud scream just outside the building, which nearly made me jump out of my skin. I heard my coworkers gasp and I took a step back, before a figure rushed into the door with a loud bang, making it shake unsteadily. Joe, who was right in front of the door, screamed and recoiled in surprise. It was Milo, his face and hands pressed against the glass, and the look on his expression contorted in fear, as if he'd just seen a ghost. "Open the door," he said in a quick breath. I took a step forward for better observation, and it was only then that I realized how wrong Milo was. His skin was completely covered in blisters, huge and pulsating, that looked like they would explode on the slightest touch. His clothes had tiny holes in it, as if they were eaten away by moths. I was so taken aback by this that I froze immediately. "Hurry, there's something out here," Milo repeated, banging on the door with his fist and looking over his shoulder. I wanted to do it, to rush to the door and let him in, but I knew it would be a bad idea. I couldn't risk letting that fog inside and putting the rest of us in danger. "Blake, please." His pleading eyes locked with mine. "Joe, what are you doing? Open the door!" Lorraine shouted from behind. "No, we can't let that fog in," Joe rebutted. I looked at the rest of my coworkers, most of who were as frozen as I was, seemingly afraid that the door might break any moment under Milo's weight. And then I heard it. A blood-curdling, high-pitched screech that came from the street, sounding like no animal I had ever heard before. It made shivers run down my spine, and it must have been mutual, because Milo looked over his shoulder once more and said, "Oh God, it's here." He looked directly back at us once more, his eyes desperately darting from one coworker to another as he banged on the door, begging us to let him in. And then something pulled him back onto the street, making him disappear in the yellow fog as he screamed bloody murder. The next few seconds were a cacophony of screams, combined with something that grotesquely reminded of meat cutting. Milo's voice gradually got quieter, stopping after what seemed like an eternity, and we were once again left in utter silence, holding our breaths nervously. And then another bang resounded on the door, making our female coworkers scream this time. Joe turned around and ran back a few steps before facing the door once more. The pane of glass now had a blood stain on it, and under it was a severed human forearm. No, not severed. The stump looked like the arm had been ripped right off, the fingers frozen in stiff contraction. "Get back!" My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I turned around, shouting at the co-workers. Needless to say, they didn't want to stick around for the show, so we ran back into the office and locked the door, barring it as quickly as we could with desks and chairs. "What the fuck was that?" Joe asked. "Did you guys see that?" Lorraine and Jessica were crying, desperately trying to call someone on their phones, but after some time we came to the conclusion that there was no service. "All right, everybody calm down," Joe said, running his fingers through his hair, visibly as stressed as the rest of us. "Help will surely be here soon. All we gotta do is wait." We reluctantly agreed, figuring that the second option was to go outside and leave, which was a no-go. I approached the window once more, and as I stared outside at the impenetrable fog, I could only think of one thing. This was no fucking fog. "What the hell is this fog outside?" I asked, peering through the window. "Whatever it is, we can't let it in." Christian said, "We need to check if all the windows are closed. Let's split up." We decided to check all the floors, in order to secure the place. Lorraine and Christian went to the second floor, Joe and Jessica to the third one, and I had to go to the last floor alone. I went up there, using the stairs, in case another chopper decided to crash and sever the elevator wires. Knowing my rotten luck, that's exactly what would happen. "All right, I'll see you in a few," I told Joe and Jessica as we split up, and I climbed the final flight of stairs. Each of the floors belonged to a separate company, and the fourth floor was used by the IT company. They were all on collective vacation though, so their floor was desolate, leaving the rows of desks and computers unattended. The windows were on the far end of the office, but luckily, most of them couldn't be opened. I immediately noticed that the windows here didn't have solely a yellow view through them, but a combination of yellow and gray. Moreover, the tops of some of the other buildings were visible from here. I strode between the desks and peered through the window. Although the yellow fog was very thick, it seemed to be gathered on the lower levels, shrouding the entire town in an impenetrable layer, which seemed to significantly reduce and stop at around the second floor. I could actually see the tops of all of the taller buildings, as the layer of fog seemed leveled equally everywhere. Moreover, although the fog covered much of the city, there was one huge area around a building nearby where it wasn't present, looking as if the building itself had an invisible shield around it, preventing the fog from getting close. I squinted, and according to my rough estimation, the building which was fog-free was the big warehouse which belonged to Happy Hour, our biggest supermarket. I noticed that one of the windows to my left was left open, so I quickly approached it, shut it. There was a sudden crash somewhere behind me. I shot around and saw the water tank overturned, rapidly spilling water on the floor. "Hello?" I foolishly asked, immediately scolding myself for acting like a stereotypical horror movie dumbass. I craned my neck to peek above and around the desks, but nothing was there. At least, that's what I thought at first. I took a step to the right and looked at the furthest desk away. Was that jacket on the chair there before? I slowly made my way towards it, carefully watching my surroundings. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight at the utter realization that that was no fucking jacket. It was a person hiding behind a chair. As if on cue, the person, or thing, whatever was behind that chair, hastily moved around and behind the desk. Without thinking, I rushed there, only to catch a glimpse of an emaciated, hunched-over creature running around the corner once more before I could catch any details. I followed around the desk again, but the creature was already at the far end, disappearing behind the corner. I ran after it, my adrenaline getting the better of me, and again, I saw the creature disappear around the next corner. I stopped and took steady breaths, bracing myself with my left hand against the desk. I heard something that sounded like scratching under the desk on the other side, where the creature had disappeared, and I just had to see what it was. Stealthily, I tiptoed around the table, the sound of scratching intensifying as I got closer. I bent down to peek under the table, and the scratching instantly stopped. There was no one there. "Pull yourself together, Blake," I said to myself. I sighed in relief, realizing that the shock was starting to get to me. I straightened up and turned around and then stopped dead in my tracks. I was standing face to face with a person, except it looked like a walking corpse, not a person. It had empty black eye sockets, brown shriveled skin, tightly stretched across the entire face and body, prominently displaying blackened teeth, ribs, cheekbones, and other visible protrusions. A few strands of gray, wet hair fell flatly over its forehead, and although it had no eyes, I felt its penetrating gaze upon me. I was frozen in place, my body screaming at me to run, but I just couldn't will myself to move an inch. The creature unclenched its jaw, and a gasp escaped its mouth, which gradually increased in tone and turned into a loud scream. I broke out of my trance and turned around, bolting the fuck out of there. I slipped on the puddle of water from the water tank on the way, but luckily managed to regain my composure and scramble out. I gave the room one final glance over my shoulder, unable to see the creature anymore, before rounding the corner. I flew down the stairs, almost tripping and breaking my neck along the way. I didn't even see Joe, until I bumped into him on the third floor. "Whoa there, partner. Why the rush?" There's something up there, we gotta get down now, I said, glancing over my shoulder. Jessica and Joe were understandably confused, but also visibly terrified. We rushed downstairs, finding Christian and Lorraine already there, sitting by a desk. Everything okay? Christian asked. No, everything is not okay, I shouted. There's some fucking creature up on the 4th floor. What? Everyone stared at me like I was a madman, demanding an explanation. I told them everything that happened up there, and while most of my co-workers agreed that I was just imagining things, Lorraine supported me, saying that she too had seen something briefly up on the 2nd floor, but wasn't sure if it was her imagination. Alright, so what the fuck is going on here? Christian asked frustratedly. It must be the fog, Joe said. Maybe it's making us see things. No, that can't be it, I said. Someone overturned the water tank. That wasn't my imagination. Everyone was silent for a while. I finally spoke up after remembering what I had seen up there. Guys, listen. The fog is only gathered on the lower levels of the city. I saw it from up there. And not only that, but the happy hour warehouse seems to have no fog around it at all. What? What do you mean no fog around it? Lorraine asked. I know it sounds crazy, but I double-checked. It's as if there's an invisible wall around the building which stops the fog from reaching it. I think if we could get there, we'd be safe. It's true, Jessica said. Joe and I saw it too. Well, we can't get there with the fog, Christian said. Or maybe we can, Jessica said. We all looked at her. She continued. The building next to ours has an underground parking lot and the subway is close by. It's a long shot, but if we could get there with a car, we may be able to use the subway to get to the warehouse. We would need to jump from our building to the adjacent one, Christian said, and we don't know if the subways have the fog in them. Well, it's better than fucking waiting here for rescue, which may not even arrive for days, Jessica said. Christian contemplated for a while before saying, No, it's too risky. We should wait for a rescue. We have enough food and water to last us for at least a few days. I agree, Joe said. The girls and I disagreed with them, but ultimately decided that splitting up would not be such a good idea. It was around 11 p.m. and most of us were sitting in the office. Joe had gone to the bathroom and the rest of us were talking to take our minds off things. Some of us tried getting in contact with the outside world with our phones and internet, but nothing seemed to be working. We tried to be as quiet as possible, trying to detect any noise coming from the upper floors, but so far everything seemed uneventful. Hey Blake, Christian said. Joe has been gone for a while. Mind checking up on him? Sure, I said, suddenly realizing that Joe has indeed been gone for at least 15 minutes. I went to the bathroom, and almost as soon as I entered it, I heard Joe retching in one of the stalls. Hey Joe, you okay, buddy? I asked as I approached the stall. He responded with another retch, the sound of his vomit splashing the toilet water. Suddenly, a horrible realization hit me. I knocked on the door and said, Joe, did you inhale any of that fog? He suddenly went quiet. I pushed the door open and beheld the mess in front of me. Joe was hugging the toilet seat, which was completely covered in blood, with a few drops making their way to the floor tiles. He turned around and faced me, the corners of his mouth covered in blood. Help me! He reached out to me. I screamed and stepped back as he crawled towards me, vomiting streams of blood along the way. The light in the bathroom started to flicker at that point, and I only saw Joe for a second at a time, but every time the lights would go out and come back, he was different. First, he had something protruding out of his neck. Then, his neck had grown long and stretched, revealing veins that looked like they were barely able to hold together on his neck. Then, the irises of his eyes disappeared and only whites remained. Then, horrible pointy bones protruded from his spine, and every second, he got closer and closer. I screamed and ran out, slamming the door shut behind me. The others obviously noticed that something was wrong, so they immediately stood up, alert. It's Joe, I said. Before I managed to finish that sentence, Joe banged loudly on the bathroom door, cutting me off. The sound of one of the windows in the office shattering resounded behind us. I jerked my head in the direction of the sound and saw an elongated, emaciated hand with bony fingers reaching out through the window and inside the office. What the frick? We gotta go, I shouted as another hand wiggled in through the window. The bathroom door burst open and there stood Joe, a deformation of his former self, with a veiny, elongated neck, his head twitching as trickles of blood ran down his mouth. His body transformed into something that very much resembled that creature upstairs. "Move!" Christian shoved me and we ran upstairs and into the elevator, not caring anymore about subsequent chopper crashes and malfunctions. I frantically slammed the button for the 4th floor and the doors closed way before Joe managed to reach us. The elevator started ascending, the sounds of inhuman screams, loud banging and heavy scraping permeating the building. I was afraid the elevator would start dropping all of a sudden, or worse, that it would open and we'd be faced with one of those abominations. The door dinged and opened. I looked over in the direction of the IT department and saw the creature from before, just standing in the middle of the office, looking at us curiously, with its head tilted. We ran upstairs and outside to the rooftop. I took a nearby pipe and jammed it between the door handle and wall, cautiously stepping back. Everything was suddenly quiet again. I just then became aware of how cold it was outside. But the thought of going back inside with those things froze my blood more than the winter air. "All right, we have no choice now. We have to get to that parking lot," Christian said. We approached the edge of the building, observing the town. The warehouse was a lot clearer from here, and despite most of the city being shrouded in darkness and fog, the warehouse stood as a beacon of hope, completely clear, its lights illuminating it as a holy sanctuary. "Look, the nearby subway entrance just outside the warehouse is also clear," Jessica pointed. "Yeah, whatever's going on there, we need to reach it. We might be safe there until this fog clears out. Plus, the place must be stocked with canned goods and drinks," I said. We went to the side, which was right next to the building we were after. The roof of the other building looked close enough to be jumped across, but looking down into the ominous fog under, the distance suddenly felt a lot more threatening. "Well, we have to make the jump," I said. I decided to go first, before anyone managed to oppose the idea. I stood as close to the edge as I could, trying to remember my long-distance jumping from college. I used all my strength and jumped, easily making it to the other side by at least 3 feet. I exhaled, sweating bullets despite the cold. "Come on," I said to my coworkers. Lorraine was next, then Jessica, and finally Christian. Once we were across, we approached the roof door and entered the building. "So what the hell is this place anyway?" Christian asked. "It's supposed to be a call center," Lorraine said. "Well, let's hope those fucking things aren't inside," I remarked as I turned on the torch on my phone. The building was dark and unnervingly quiet, with only the sound of our footsteps thudding on the carpet. I was at the back, while Christian was in front, his light bobbing up and down. We went down to the 2nd floor when I heard something in the distance from behind. "Guys, you hear that?" I shot around and perked up my ears. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but the more I listened, the more the sound started to become clear, as it was steady and repetitive. It sounded like someone was crying. I slowly made my way towards the source of the sound, the crying growing clearer. It was coming from the bathroom. I placed my ear against the door. It was definitely someone crying, maybe a little boy. I grabbed the door handle and slowly pushed the door open, which creaked an alarmingly loud creak. Sometime during the creaking, the crying stopped and I gasped at what I saw in front of me. I took a step forward, glancing around in awe. It was my childhood room. There was a bed with star decorations on it, Power Ranger posters on the walls, and a desk where I did my homework in the corner of the room. I looked behind, and instead of the hallway from the building I'd just been, I was faced with the closed wooden door of my childhood room. I heard crying again, this time right behind me, and I shot around, only to see a little boy sitting on the bed, his face buried in his hands as he wept. It was me as a kid. I remembered this. Of course I did. How could I possibly forget? I was 7 years old back then, and I had just received news of my mom being found dead. There was a police officer in the room with me, and he tried consoling me by giving me his hat and telling me that I needed to be brave. I approached the boy and knelt down. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked. He ignored me and continued crying. "You shouldn't be here, it's not safe," I said with a soft tone. The kid stopped crying but kept holding his hands over his face. Suddenly, the lights started flickering and the kid raised his head, revealing a rotted face with hollow, empty sockets and blackened teeth. I screamed and fell backwards, scrambling until my back hit the wall. The kid stood up, his empty holes for eyes staring directly at me. He opened his mouth, and a handful of maggots dropped out of it and onto the floor as he made his way slowly towards me. As the light flickered, the boy disappeared, and I was once again instead faced with that walking corpse from the IT office. It slowly made its way towards me, each step it took making a soft, squishy sound on the carpet. It was only inches away from my face, and I saw every blemish on it, every crack in its skin, every jag of its teeth. But the eye sockets remained impenetrably black. The creature forcefully put his hand on my shoulder, and I screamed once more. "Blake, calm down!" Jessica was standing in front of me. I frantically looked around for the monster or the boy, but they were gone. Moreover, the room itself was gone, and I was on the floor of the office bathroom. What? I stood up, spinning in circles. "Where's the monster?" "Blake, are you okay?" Jessica asked. "It was right here, didn't you see it?" I became hysterical. "Blake, there's no monster," Christian said patronizingly. "Are you feeling all right?" "It must be the fog. I think I'm seeing things." "You guys didn't see anything?" I said. "Wait, where's Lorraine?" We looked around, but she was nowhere to be found. And then there was a scream. We rushed outside and found Lorraine in the corner of the kitchen, clutching a knife with trembling hands. She was darting her eyes around the room and swinging the knife in random directions. "Get away!" she screamed with each swing. "Lorraine, calm down!" Christian shouted as he approached her cautiously, but refused to get too close. Lorraine shot him a confused glance and then started swatting at her arms in a panic. "Get them off me!" she screamed. Christian tried approaching her, but one swing of the knife near his face was enough to dissuade him from doing so. Lorraine started slicing at her forearms, causing deep cuts and blood to gush with each cut. "Lorraine, stop!" Jessica cried, but Lorraine wouldn't listen. She pointed the knife inward and started stabbing her own arm higher and higher until her knife reached her shoulder and then her neck until she lodged it above her collarbone. Her screams immediately stopped and she let go of the knife, her glare turning into a combined look of confusion and terror as she glanced at her blood-covered palms. She fell on her knees and then collapsed sideways, her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Jessica screamed hysterically while Christian held clumps of hair on his head. I approached Lorraine to check her pulse, but it was too late. Had we been quicker, the slices of her forearms could have been treated, but the stab in her neck did her in. "Oh, Jesus," Christian's voice quivered. We can't stay here," I hesitantly said. "Oh God, Lorraine," Jessica sobbed, holding her hands over her mouth. We collected ourselves and made our way downstairs without uttering a single word. We were too traumatized by this point to speak at all. In a matter of minutes, we got to the parking lot without any more occurrences. Over there was a mess, with cars crashed all over the place and dead bodies strewn about. The office workers obviously tried to make it out in a hurry. The exit was wide open though, and the fog didn't seem to make its way inside the lot. We found one car with the doors wide open and keys still in the ignition. "That's our way out," I said. We took as much fabric as we could and stuffed it inside the car at the door frames and other potential leaking places to prevent the fog from getting in. "You guys ready?" I asked as the engine roared to life. With heart thumping fast, I floored it and drove out of the parking lot and straight into the wall of yellow fog. As soon as I did, I became almost completely blind to everything around me, being able to see only a few feet ahead. "The subway should be that way," Christian pointed, and I followed his directions. The street had crashed cars which I had to drive around, but I tried to speed up, eager to get out of the fog as soon as possible. That was a mistake, because as soon as I did, a person appeared in front of my car. That same eyeless corpse that kept haunting me, just standing in the middle of the road. I swerved, but it was too late. I hit the corpse, which bumped into the windshield and cracked it, and I lost control of the car, crashing it into a nearby wall. I lost consciousness after that. Blake, wake up!" I woke up to a voice that sounded like it was coming from a tunnel far away. My head was throbbing from the crash and the loud blaring of the car horn. "Come on, Blake, we gotta go now!" I recognized Christian's voice. As my blurry vision started to clear up, I became aware of the severity of the predicament I was in. The windshield was cracked, and thin wisps of yellow smoke were seeping in, gyrating in the car. This shook me wide awake instantly, and I shot up in my car seat, frantically swiveling my head from left to right. Christian and Jessica were all right, by the looks of it. "Put something over your mouth and hold your breath as long as you can," Christian said. "The subway is right there. Ready?" I took a shirt which I previously stuffed near the car window and wrapped it around my head, tightly holding my hand over my mouth. Christian and Jessica did the same. "All right, on 3, I said as I held the door handle. I took a deep breath and counted to 3 on my fingers. On the 3rd count, we burst out into the cold outside. Christian immediately took lead, and Jessica and I followed him. I heard screams somewhere in the distance, so I hurried up, practically bumping into Christian from behind. At times, I thought I heard frantic footsteps next to me in the fog, just outside my line of sight. But whenever I looked in the direction, they would stop. I was running out of breath and desperately wanted to gasp for air, pressure building up in my head, but I resisted the urge. Christian waved for us to follow him faster as he descended downstairs into the subway. Almost as soon as we started going downstairs, the fog cleared out, and we were met with somewhat clear subway air. We took off our improvised gas masks and stood there, panting for a while. "Fuck," I said between breaths. "That was my bad. I saw someone on the road. Never mind about that," Jessica said. "We need to find our way to the warehouse. It's on Luther Street." She approached the map on the wall, which may as well have been hieroglyphics to me, and inspected it silently. She ran her index finger across the map here and there for a moment, before turning back to us and saying, "Okay, I know the way. It's not too far away." "Give me a goddamn minute," Christian said. "I can't fucking breathe." When he regained his composure, we stood up and followed Jessica through the tunnel, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the place, making me feel like a sitting duck. "What?" Christian asked, looking back at Jessica. "I didn't say anything," she responded. "You called my name just now, I heard you," he insisted. "Christian, I didn't. Now keep quiet, will ya?" We went on for a bit, and all of a sudden, Jessica stopped, gasping loudly and shooting her stare to her left. "Jessica, what's wrong?" I asked. "Did you guys hear that?" she said, pointing her torch somewhere in the dark. No? Hear what?" Christian asked. "Someone screamed just now. You didn't hear it?" she asked. "Jessica, it may have been the pipes or something. Now come on," Christian said. We continued, and it wasn't long until I heard a voice calling my name from somewhere behind. It was so quiet that I thought I may have imagined it first, so briefly made sure that no one was behind me and continued following my co-workers. "Blake." The voice came again, but this time directly in my ear. "Are you sure you're okay?" it asked, a handful of maggots falling out of its mouth and onto the floor with wet thuds. I closed my eyes firmly and pounded on my head. "Get out," I repeated with each hit. "Hey, Blake!" I opened my eyes and was faced with Christian holding my shoulder and Jessica standing behind him with a concerned look. "Don't go psychotic on me now, buddy." I exhaled deeply and said, "Guys, we've all seen some pretty weird shit today, but what if none of it is real?" "What do you mean?" Jessica asked. "I mean, what if this fog is some sort of chemical which makes you see weird shit?" "That's absurd," Christian said. "We all saw what happened to Milo and then what happened to Joe." "What did happen to Joe?" I asked. "Oh, come on," Christian scoffed. "No, tell me, what did you see?" I started to get accusatory. Christian looked at Jessica, as if looking for support, but when she didn't meet his gaze, he shrugged and said, "Joe stumbled out of the bathroom on all fours with some sort of fucking thorn sticking out of his back." Jessica immediately jerked her head in Christian's direction. "That's not what I saw," she said. "When he stumbled out, he was holding his stomach and his intestines were slipping out of his gut." "See?" I pointed at Jessica while maintaining eye contact with Christian. Back at the office, I saw something in the IT department, and then something in the bathroom of the call center. And then Milo, he had huge blisters on him and something just dragged him back into the mist. If the fog really was toxic, how did we get through it without getting the same blisters? I saw Milo differently. Christian looked down. He was missing an arm and an eye. I think the fog plays tricks on our mind based on our fears or something. I've been seeing some things which simply couldn't have been real, I said. They both went silent for a moment. It's true, Jessica nodded with her arms crossed. Tears formed in her eyes, glistening from the torches of our phones as she said, I keep seeing and hearing my late husband. He was in a car accident and I keep seeing him everywhere, all mutilated like he was in the car crash, and he blames me for it. But instead of speaking, I hear gurgling noises because his neck is broken. She put her hand over her eyes and wept. Christian put his arm around her shoulder. It does make sense when you put it that way, he said. I keep spacing out here and there, finding myself on tops of skyscrapers or falling down, and then I blink and I'm back in reality. I thought I was losing my mind. When Jessica finally calmed down, she asked, What about you, Blake? What do you see? I looked down and thought for a while, remembering the corpse which kept haunting me. I stuttered. I see my mother. I closed my eyes and sighed deeply before continuing. My dad used to drink a lot and beat my mom. One day, she couldn't take it anymore and left, so I was left to live with my dad. He became changed man right after she left. He stopped drinking and never lay a finger on me. It was around that time that he locked the basement tightly and never allowed me to get anywhere near it. I was 7 years old when my dad left the basement door open and went to work. Of course, I was curious about it, so I did what any 7-year-old would do. I went inside. I saw that there was a completely normal room inside, with a small TV which was on, bed, and a rocking chair. There was a person sitting in the chair, facing away from me, and at first I didn't know who would be sitting in our basement. So I called out to the person, but they didn't respond. Heck, they weren't even moving. I went closer and then stepped around the chair to see who it was. It was a dead body, and by the looks of it, the person had been dead for years, with dried up skin, black, empty eye sockets, and a mouth which was agape. Although I was a kid, I knew that the right thing to do would be to call the cops, so I did so. And not long after they got to the house, they arrested my dad and informed me of the sad news that the dead person was actually my mother. Jesus, Blake, Jessica said. I continued. According to the cops, my dad drank too much one night and got too rough with my mom. He broke her neck and couldn't face what he did, so he put her body in the basement and tried to live a normal family life, as if nothing ever happened. Fuck, bro, Christian remarked. A moment of silence went by before he asked tentatively, So what happened to you after that? My aunt took care of me, and that was pretty much that. As for my dad, I heard he killed himself in prison years ago. Not that I care. The tunnel was silent for a long time now. I didn't like being in the center of attention, so I said, Look, let's just get to the warehouse. We might find some answers there. Okay, it's close now, Jessica said. We walked in silence for a while, still apprehensive over the voices we heard in the tunnel. A few minutes of walking and Jessica stopped in front of another map at a train station and observed it under the phone light, shining it in various directions. Christian and I stood by her side dumbly, like students in a school project that have no idea what to do, and thus let the most competent project member deal with the whole thing. This is pretty much how it was at work too. A moment later, she turned in the opposite direction and said, This way, come on. She strode towards the stairs, too fast for us to follow her at our normal pace. The stairs went up into a brightly illuminated maze of tunnels. There were shops on all sides, but most of them had shutters down. When we turned around the corner, Jessica stopped and gasped. Christian and I ran there quickly and were faced with the body of a woman who was lying face down on the floor. Are you guys seeing this? Jessica asked. If by this you mean a dead body, then yes, Christian said. We better go, I said, tearing my gaze away from the dead woman. We carefully went around her with hasty steps and followed Jessica to the bottom of the next set of stairs. She stopped so abruptly that Christian almost bumped into her and I into him. "Hey, what gives?" he asked. Jessica stared at the top of the stairs, so we followed her gaze there. Just beyond the stairwell, we saw the night sky, a part of a building. "No fog, and there's the warehouse," she said, pointing up. "Kick-ass. Nice work, Jess," Christian said. We climbed the stairs and felt the cold air on our faces once more. We were directly in front of the big warehouse, untouched by the fog. It became clear from first glance that the building had huge AC-like devices with huge fans plastered all over its walls, which we assumed was the reason behind the building's protection from the fog. There was no trace of the fog on the premise, but it surrounded the building itself like a thick blanket, making it impossible to see further than the pedestrian's pavement. The fog seemed to swirl ominously at the edge of the barrier, but never went past it. We went around the fence until we found an open gate, and from there, a big door which led inside. The first thing which we noticed immediately, which got us a little worried, was the fact that the door was wide open. As we got closer, a loud humming noise started to permeate the air, and it became clear that it was coming from the ACs. "Hello?" Jessica shouted as soon as we stepped inside the building, her voice echoing in the place. Although the warehouse was engulfed in darkness, it immediately became clear that it was so big that we'd need, by my rough estimate, at least 5 minutes of walking in a straight line in order to reach the other side. Hundreds of sealed boxes were neatly stacked in various rows of the place, some too tall to be reached without a ladder or forklift. "Keep it down, will you?" Christian said in a hushed tone. "Why, there could be survivors." Jessica shook her head. "Yeah, but for all we know, they could be delusional like Lorraine was." I said, "Let's keep it down for now until we assess the situation." We started to explore the area, our phone torches pointed in front of us. I took point this time, and I wish I hadn't, because when turned around the corner of one of the box stacks, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. The light from my torch illuminated a human leg strewn on the floor, surrounded by a pool of dried blood. As I moved the light further up, I realized the leg was actually severed. "Jesus," I said, and heard my co-workers curse under their breaths behind me. I pointed my light in the direction ahead and illuminated a dead body of a man on the floor, his mouth agape and trickles of blood dried on his mouth. His eyes were closed, so he almost looked as if he was sleeping. His leg was missing, and around was a large pool of blood, not yet fully dry. We ran into more and more scenes that a gore fan could only wish for. A severed arm here, a crushed head there, blood all over the place, etc. "What the fuck happened here? Did the fog get to them before they vented it out?" Chris asked. We couldn't exactly tell who or what killed them, but judging by the fact that a lot of them still clutched various blood-stained tools, we deduced that the fog must have caused them to hallucinate and slaughter each other. "Look over here." Jessica pointed to the far end of the aisle. There was a slow flickering red light at the far end. We carefully followed it, stepping around the dead bodies. Upon reaching the light, it became obvious that it was coming from a radio on the desk. It looked old, but well preserved. "Holy crap, maybe we can use this to call for help," Christian said. "Well, let's try it." I hesitantly agreed, not even sure how to operate it. There was a dial, which we slowly turned until we heard static. As we continued turning it, the static slowly started mixing up with inaudible voices. We turned it a little more, and the voices became a lot clearer. "It works," Jessica said. "Let's try to contact them." I flicked a button and leaned closer to the microphone. "Can anyone hear me? This is an emergency." There was silence for a moment, and I opened my mouth to shout again, when a voice came from the radio, staticky, but clear enough. "Please state your situation. Over." My excitement surged, and I quickly leaned in and said, "We're in danger. We're located in the warehouse of Luther Street and need immediate rescue. Please send someone. Over." "Please repeat, over." The voice calmly came in. I repeated what I said, slowly this time. A moment of silence went by before the voice resounded again. "A rescue chopper has been dispatched. Stand by." "Yes, fucking finally!" Christian shouted, raising his fist victoriously. "Okay, let's head outside," I tried saying before a rough, deep voice interrupted me from behind. "What are you doing?" he said scoldingly. All three of us turned around, pointing our lights at a middle-aged man in the blue happy hour uniform. His bald head was covered in sweat and dust, and his eyes were wide in fear. His chest was heaving up and down, as if he had just been running. "What did you do?" he asked again, darting his eyes around. "Hey, don't worry. We called rescue via radio. They'll be here soon," I said. "You did what?" he said. "We have to run. Oh, God." He grabbed his head and paced around before turning to us and saying, "We have to run. Now." "Wait, what? Why?" Jessica asked. "Because that's not rescue," he said. "What?" I laughed at the absurdity of his statement. "We have to hide. Now!" the stranger commanded. Christian, Jessica, and I shot each other perplexed glances, but the man was already striding down the aisle. We caught up to him, following closely behind. "Wait, just wait a goddamn second," Christian said. "Not now. They're almost here. Listen," the man said and raised an index finger, his bald head glistening from sweat. We perked up our ears, and then we heard it, the whirring of a helicopter outside. It was barely audible at first, but it soon amplified until it permeated the air entirely. It was against all humane logic to think that these military guys were here to neutralize us. I mean, that's the stuff of Hollywood movies. But when I heard the door violently burst open, something in my gut told me to stay away from them as far as possible. "Get behind now," the man said, peeking around the corner of a big stack of boxes. We got behind cover and turned off our torches as the man continued peeking. "Any sign of them?" a voice from somewhere in the warehouse asked. "Negative," another responded. "Keep your eyes peeled. Can't let them get out of here." I saw beams of flashlight protruding from behind the corner for a moment, before disappearing and engulfing us in darkness once more. The worker pulled out something from his pocket and held it firmly in his right hand. My eyes fell on the object he was holding, and I saw a small vial. Yellow wisps of smoke twirled around in the bottle between his fingers, like trapped smoke that was trying to look for a way out. "Is that the fog?" I asked quietly. He looked back and said, "Prepare to move." He faced the direction of the soldiers and chucked the vial in their direction, immediately retreating behind cover. There was a sound of glass breaking a moment later, and the soldiers frantically started shouting. Gunshots filled the air, startling all of us, and the old man who threw the vial gestured for us to follow him immediately. "Hold your fire," one of the soldiers shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a series of gunshots. We ran from one cover to the other, and as I glanced towards the soldiers' direction, I saw a thick blanket of yellow fog, illuminated by a number of flashlights that seemed to be pointed in various directions. Some of the flashlights lay still on the floor. The gunfire had completely subsided soon, and the only sound that filled the air was the heavy footsteps of our group running across the concrete floor. "Stay the fuck back," one of the soldiers shouted, shooting somewhere and then screaming panickingly. I looked back and saw the wisps of yellow smoke slowly spreading towards us from around the corner, like tendrils of an insidious parasite threatening to voraciously devour us. "This way." The old man stopped in the middle of the aisle and knelt down. He opened a big hatch and pointed for us to go down a ladder, which was practically invisible in the dark. We were too panicked to worry about that right now, so we followed his order. First Jessica, then Christian, and then me. I blindly grasped the cold metal bars feverishly, carefully taking step by step down. "Hey, watch it," Christian said when I accidentally stepped on his hand. I glanced down, but only saw a faint light at the bottom, which seemed about a dozen feet below. It renewed my hope, because the last thing I wanted was to be stuck in a dark, claustrophobia-inducing room, with the only way out being in the direction of the soldiers and the fog. I felt my feet touch the floor after what felt like minutes, even though in reality it was just seconds. I looked around the dark room. There was a dim glow coming from a fragile-looking ceiling light, which illuminated rows of boxes neatly stacked atop one another. These boxes were different than the ones above, though. They looked more sturdy and secure, reminiscent of military boxes. They had the warning, "Do not rough handle" on them, and had heavy-duty padlocks. "What is this?" Jessica asked, curiously observing one of the stacks. I saw that one of the boxes had been opened and I approached it carefully, inspecting the contents. As soon as I realized what was inside, I recoiled in surprise and fear. "Don't touch that," the man that saved us said, scuttling past me and closing the lid of the box with a loud thud. Before the box was closed, I managed to observe a handful of vials full of yellow-looking smoke, which furiously swirled inside and contrasted the dark room. "Is that what's causing the fog?" I asked. A few more gunshots came from above, which made all of us unanimously look up. The man sighed, wiping the sweat off his forehead. "Yeah, fucking military, I tell you. I didn't even know what I was signing up for, and by the time I figured it out, I was in too deep to get out alive." "What exactly happened here?" Christian asked. The man shook his head with a disappointed look on his face and said, "I don't know when it all started. We were assigned to work here a few months back, and the company didn't really give us any details. They just said we'd have to stack boxes, that's it. We found it strange that military guys were bringing in and taking out the boxes, though. And the way they are secured." He pointed to the stack next to him. "I'm no genius, but you don't keep dairy products in these kinds of containers. Anyway, we were never really allowed to open any boxes. Not that we'd be able to either." "So Happy Hour was in cahoots with the military on some secret project?" I asked. "No, not exactly," the man said. "Happy Hour is in charge of the project. You see, Happy Hour operates as a supermarket on the surface, but that's just their public image, so that they can conceal their true intentions." There was a moment of silence as my co-workers and I stared at the man. He continued, "These things right here in the boxes, they are extremely dangerous. One of these vials is enough to cover an area of roughly 10,000 square feet. Now you can imagine what would happen if there was an accident with one of the boxes severe enough to cause a chain reaction. An entire city gone to shit. I don't even know what exactly happened, but I suspect my coworker James tried opening one. He's been eyeing them for a while now. Dumbass probably hit one too hard. The next thing we knew, there was an explosion and the fog was everywhere." "How did you manage to survive?" Jessica asked. "This." He stepped out of the light for a few seconds and came back with a gas mask. "I wore this sucker and stayed down here until the area got vented." "And how do you know all of this about Happy Hour's operations?" I asked suspiciously. "They have all of it written here." He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "The dumbasses left it downstairs here, and I intend to show it to the police as soon as I'm out of here." "So let me get this straight," Christian said. "Happy Hour is not actually Happy Hour, but rather some evil organization that handles these fog vials? But what for?" The man shrugged. "Beats me. Trading it on the black market. Using it to take over the world? Doesn't matter now anyway." "So what does it do anyway?" Jessica asked. "I don't know the details, but I can tell you it affects your brain and causes severe hallucinations. It was engineered very scrupulously in order to maximize its effect and make it deadly. I mean, can you imagine? You have a base full of hostiles. You throw in one of these bad boys, and they kill each other, without you ever having to deal with them yourself. It's no wonder that every army would want their hands on it." "So what now? We can't stay down here forever," Jessica said. "No, we can't. They'll be here to collect their stuff and clean up all the evidence as soon as the fog starts to clear up. However, that may not happen in days. Our best bet is to get out of here as soon as we can. Here." He stepped out of the light once more. There was a sound of shuffling for a few seconds until he came back, holding 3 more gas masks. "Put these on and let's go." We donned the masks, while the old man carefully performed a thorough check on us to make sure they were on properly. "So with these masks, we can just walk out of the city with no trouble, right?" Christian asked. "No, it's not that simple," the old man said as he put his own mask. "We'll have to get to the only checkpoint which is safe. It's not too far away." "Why didn't you try to run away until now?" Jessica asked with a muffled voice under the mask. "I was going to, but when this all first happened, I was hiding and then I was too afraid to step into the fog and so on. Doesn't matter, now we're ready to go." And how do you know someone won't try to kill us at the checkpoint? I asked. They won't. The military will be waiting at the checkpoint. What we saw in here was not the military. He grabbed 2 of the glowing vials and put them in his pockets. We need to give this to them so they can study it and put a stop to these fuckers, he said as he grabbed a nearby baseball bat. He gave it a few swings, flaying the air with a whistling sound the bat made. With that, we got out of the bunker, leaving the plethora of weaponized boxes behind us. The fog was so thick inside the warehouse now that we had to hold our hands together, while the old man held his free hand on the aisle of boxes in order to see where he was going. Luckily, before we even reached the exit, the venting system started to do its thing and the fog somewhat dispersed, giving us meager visibility. We were lucky enough not to run into the corpses of the soldiers. It felt relieving to get out of there and finally see something in front, which wasn't just a blanket of yellow. I had started to feel uncomfortable with my gas mask by then, but when I tried taking it off, the old man shouted, "Hey, do not do that." I didn't need to be reminded twice. He seemed to know his way around, so I decided to obey. He took a moment to orient himself before pointing over yonder and saying, "Okay, this way." We followed him through the clear air until we reached the wall of fog again. We hesitated, but the old man didn't seem to mind at all, as he simply stepped through the swirling wall, vanishing within the deadly yellow in an instant. We followed closely behind, keeping at each other's heels in order to avoid getting lost. The old man was in front, with me behind, and Jessica and Christian at the back. "How far away is it?" I shouted to our guide. "A few more minutes," he said. We walked for a couple of minutes through the thick fog on the streets, taking a few disorienting turns, when all of a sudden the old man was gone. "Hey, old man!" I shouted, not even knowing his real name. "Where are you?" There was no response. "Hey!" Christian shouted, but like me was met with unnerving silence. We walked in circles for minutes, calling out to him, but there was no response. "Fuck, where did he go, damn it?" I said, feeling defeated. And then I heard a loud thump behind me. I turned around and saw Jessica on the floor. Christian stood there bewildered, staring at our co-worker. "Jessica? No, this isn't real, that's not her," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. As he took a step back, a hand reached out from the fog and pulled him back, the yellow mist instantly swallowing him. "No, please," I heard Christian shout, before another loud thump occurred, and then another, and soon those thumps turned into cracking and then mushy sounds, as if someone was hitting a wet pile. And then it stopped completely. I stood frozen, my panicked breaths fogging up my mask goggles, as I contemplated if I should run or avoid moving altogether. Was my mask faulty? Was I hallucinating? I swallowed painfully and took a step forward, and the sight almost made me puke inside my mask. Christian's body lay on the floor, with blood all around his head, or whatever was left of it. His face was practically bashed in, one eye sticking out, staring into nothingness. Bits of brain splattered around. Another thump resounded right in my ear, and this one caused a sharp pang pain in my head and toppled me over. I fell down, my head spinning and my vision blurry. A pair of boots came into my view as someone stopped right in front of me. "You should know better than to trust strangers," a voice said, and when I looked up, I saw the old man holding his baseball bat firmly. Blood still dripped from it onto the floor, and the sudden realization hit me of how stupid we were. He knelt down and sighed, shaking his head. "Real fucking shame. I didn't want to do this, but you guys just had to show up and screw up my plans. I was doing you a favor, though. The guys at the checkpoint aren't really rescue. There's some shady people who I plan to sell the vials to. Oh, and those guys back at the warehouse. They were rescue. They were going to quarantine you for a while, yeah. But they were there to rescue you. Anyway, I gotta go. I'll take your lady friend with me because I assume those guys are going to need a test subject. I'll let you live, but don't try to follow us. I'll fucking kill you," I muttered, frothing at the mouth out of pure anger. "I see," he calmly said. "Well, I can't have that." He sighed, shaking his head as if contemplating what to do with a problematic kid. He reached out to me and with a strong yank, he pulled off my mask. I watched in horror as the old man threw my gas mask away into the fog and picked up Jessica with a grunt. He put her over his back and left the sight whistling, vanishing in the mist. My head was still spinning from the hit I got on my head, but I did my best to scramble on all fours. I feverishly felt the ground, frantically looking for the mask, but was only met with the cold concrete, surrounded by the yellow mist. I knew I didn't have much time left because I started to hear whispers around me. I tried ignoring them, knowing they were just a figment of my imagination. But the longer I stayed, the louder and more intense they got. I lost my cool when I heard a scream directly in my ear. I turned around and saw that same visage of a rotting body standing in front of me, with its mouth widely open, producing a high-pitched shriek. I started running, the scream following closely behind me, never changing their pitch, tone, or distance. It was always directly behind me. Before I knew it, I was faced with an open building, and I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. The screams instantly stopped, and I was met with an eerie silence. I sighed, steadying my heavy breathing, but I could feel my breaths becoming shallow again when I turned around. I was in my parents' living room. "Blake, don't make me say it twice," I heard a stern male voice say from nearby. I followed the voice to the basement door and saw my dad standing there, in stained clothes, towering above myself when I was a kid. "Dad, please," little Blake cried, wiping his tears. My dad bent down and shook little me by the shoulders violently. "You will do as I say, Blake. She is your mother, and you have to respect her, you little shit." He took a nearby platter with food and shoved it into the boy's hands, practically pushing him down the stairs. "And don't come back until you've fed her the whole goddamn thing. Fucking spoiled brat." He muttered that last sentence to himself and slumped down on the sofa, grabbing the beer bottle from the table and turned on the TV. Although my dad passed right next to me, he seemed completely oblivious to my presence. I glanced down at the basement and followed the boy closely behind as he went down step by step, the dishes clattering from the shaking in his hands. The basement was illuminated by the static on the TV, and the rocking chair, which was in front of it, was partly illuminated. "Mommy," the boy said between sobs as it approached and gently put the platter on the coffee table. "I brought you some food." I came around to the other side of the boy while not taking my eyes off my mother's frozen figure in the rocking chair. She wasn't rotted this time, though. She looked like she was peacefully sleeping, the light from the TV illuminating her face. Mommy?" the boy said again, except it wasn't the boy, it was me who said it. Little Blake was gone and I was instead in his place. I took a careful step closer and closer, until I was only inches away from my mother's face. Her head was slumped to the side, her mouth and eyes closed peacefully. The TV suddenly turned off, leaving me in total darkness. When it came back on, my mother's body was in a more deteriorating state, with pale, bloated skin. The TV flickered again and again, and every time it did, my mother degraded more, until she was all decomposed, with sunken holes for eyes and brownish skin. I suddenly remembered all those years of how my father forced me to go downstairs and bring food to my mother, talk to her as if she were still alive day after day as she slowly decomposed. I didn't tell my coworkers the full truth. How could I? I never told anyone about it and pushed it far back to the darkest corners of my mind, only remembering it in my nightmares. Tears welled up in my eyes and I put my hand on my mother's. "I'm so sorry," I said, crying. Suddenly she grabbed me by the wrist with a feverish grip, and I strained to break free as she slowly stood up with the sound of cracking skin and snapping bones. Just before she fully stood up, I broke free of her grasp and fell backwards, knocking over the platter of food. My mother slowly made her way towards me, making a low, gurgling noise with each step. I looked to my left and saw the knife which dropped from the plate. I scrambled towards it, grabbed it, and drove the knife into her neck over and over. Black blood started oozing out, and the gurgling noise intensified, getting louder by the second. The creature that was my mother fell on its knees, but I continued stabbing it, infuriated and completely under the control of my boiling anger. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I turned around and stabbed the knife into that person as well, with a fierce cry, and then my rage disappeared in an instant. I stared at Jessica as her look of confusion turned into horror when she found and pulled the knife out of her neck, causing blood to spurt out in large quantities. I didn't know what to do, so I simply stared as she collapsed on the floor and stopped breathing altogether, a big pool of blood forming around her body. "Jessica, no!" I knelt down, grabbing her by the back of the head, only just then realizing how much my hands and clothes were covered in blood. "Jessica, I'm so sorry," I said, closing her eyes with my fingers. I looked around and saw that I was in the lobby of a hotel. Aside from Jessica, there was also the dead body of the man who crossed us over. He still had his gas mask on and was strewn on the floor with stab wounds all over his neck. I approached him and took off his mask, staring at his vacant eyes, not feeling remorse for killing him. I put on the mask and searched his pockets for the vials. They were there, so I took both of them and went towards the exit. Almost as soon as I opened the door, I was met with a group of soldiers wearing gas masks who pointed their guns at me. I raised my hands, telling them not to shoot, but they ignored me and simply went past me into the building. The sounds of voices, helicopters, and vehicles permeated the streets, and just then I realized that there was no fog anymore. The city was a mess, with dead bodies and crashed cars everywhere, but there was no sign of the fog. The military was everywhere, with choppers and armored vehicles in the city, making it look like a war zone. I was escorted to a base outside the city and treated for injuries. It wasn't long until they figured I had the vials on me, so they started to interrogate me about them. I told them about the warehouse and the secret weapon used by Happy Hour, and they immediately dispatched someone there. Upon return, they said that they found the warehouse and the underground hatch that led inside, but it was empty, with no boxes full of vials anywhere to be found. They made me sign a bunch of papers, which was basically them forcing me on a vow of silence. The city has been off limits for months now, and I keep experiencing vivid hallucinations every day. I either see my dead mother or my coworkers, or I wake up to find Jessica strangling me while I'm in bed, with the knife still sticking out of her throat. I learned to live with the nightmares, the PTSD, and the guilt. But one thing still bothers me though. I can't find any information on the company called Happy Hour. The websites no longer exist, their supermarkets have been closed down, and no one seems to know why. Those boxes in the warehouse went missing just before the fog dispersed, which means someone took them. And the next time they use them, they will probably do it in a more calculated manner.